Greetings, friends. I want to play you two clips from RamzPaul's recent videos, one on February 9th, one on February 10th, although I'm going to play them in reverse order. And I mean it as a friendly and constructive criticism from a fan. Because when you agree with people, there's nothing really to say. It's when you disagree with people that, you can get to explore the issue.
So as a conservative, and if you're really going to be what I am, a revolutionary conservative, or you could call me a reactionary, you got to reject everything that came out of the French Revolution, all that type of thinking. And I know that's shocking for most people even to get their minds around, but that's what we have to do if we're on the right. Because if we're going to buy into the premise of the left, we're just always going to be following them. And that's what happens, and that's what we see happening. It's whatever the left does, or what they call the progressive, because it's progressing. People on the right, they're like, that's a little too far. I mean, we kind of agree with this, but maybe it's a little too far. And as we saw with this Don Jr., for some reason announcing homosexuals in the cabinet is some conservative value. That is to be expected.
So I think that's a pretty good way of summarizing what it means to be a conservative, and I agree with what he's saying. You might go further back than the French Revolution, but I mean, that doesn't mean he believes that everything is about the French Revolution. Now in the next clip, he's responding to some letters he got from people who were very challenged by circumstances in life, like losing a job and not really knowing what to do, what path to take in life. And he talked a bit about his own experience in the corporate background and eventually leaving that world. But early on in his response, he went into a story from the Bible.
One of the things that came to my mind was the Bible story of Jonah. And Jonah, if you don't know the Bible story, was God told him to go to Nineveh to preach. But Jonah didn't want to do that, so he kept trying to run away from God's will. In fact, he got on a boat, and a big storm happened, and the sailors, they blamed Jonah for the storm. They threw him over the boat into the sea, and then a great fish or a whale swallowed him, and Jonah was inside the whale for like 3 days and 3 nights, and then he was spat out on the beach. And then Jonah realized, I better go to Nineveh and do what God wants me to do. Now, I'm a Christian, but at the same time, I don't take things literally. I don't think this story is literally true that someone, was thrown off the boat and a whale or great fish swallowed him for 3 days. But that's not the point. The point is to tell a story, it's sort of a metaphor or analogy of how life works. And I believe in God, and even the Romans believed, like the Stoics, that there's something greater than you. And we have a mission in life. And if you believe in God, a lot of times God will want you to go in a different direction. And if you resist that, you can try to resist it, but you get all these roadblocks and things get really hard for you. And sometimes if you're really stubborn and you refuse to do what God wants you to do, you get thrown over the boat and you get swallowed by the whale, metaphorically. And that's kind of what happened to me. Because I knew that I was supposed to do something else. I was supposed to do like these videos.
So that's the metaphor, RamzPaul. The event in your own life when you felt overwhelmed by circumstances and hopeless, that's a reference or a resemblance of an event which we must take as literal or real. Otherwise, then it just becomes a metaphor referencing another metaphor, like some sort of mirror, where it's just an endless, mirror. It's like, no, we're not floating in a world of mirrors. There's a real reality there. That's the metaphor. So we can take analogies and metaphors from the Bible, but that doesn't mean we start looking at these basic stories in the Bible as metaphors or analogies. That's actually very dangerous. I mean, is it an analogy that Jesus is the Son of God? And is it a metaphor that Jesus is God? And did Jesus raise people from the dead? And did he perform miracles? What about the spirits he took out of the man, and which went into the herd of pigs, which then drove themselves off a cliff? Like, was that also just not? There's no, that didn't actually happen the way it was described, or I mean, this just opens up a whole can of worms. I've talked about this in a previous video. Uh, Ramsey Paul understands how political developments spiral into more and more chaos. But I don't know if he understands that the same can happen with spiritual ideas, heresies. They can spiral over generations into more and more chaos, more and more evil. It's actually connected. So he's of this I wouldn't say generation because it's multiple generations of going back to well, you could say higher criticism, which came out of the Protestant Reformation, but I guess it really got going in the 19th century in places like Germany, where these intellectuals who had now access to all the languages and all the great scholarly resources were able to come up with their own academic interpretations of the Bible. Really goes back to these old heresies that keep coming up again and again, and goes back to pretty much the beginning, like right after after Christ. There was already perversion of his teachings going on, as we know there would be. And it all begins with just like, oh, maybe I can do this a little different, or just make an exception just for a little bit here, so we can, and sooner or later, before you know it, you're on a path completely astray from the truth. Because is the truth? Right? So it's pretty stark there. You have to stick to a certain tradition. And you shouldn't be like, well, I don't literally believe in Jonah being swallowed by a whale. But if you're going to say that, then where do you stop? Because then you're pretty close to saying, well, Christ, maybe he wasn't actually God, but the Spirit of God can enlighten people. You're on the path to saying something like that then, because you got to take it or leave it, right? Do you believe in the supernatural? If God created the world in 6 days, and on the seventh day he rested, and he can part the seas to let the Israelites pass when they were escaping the Egyptians. If God can do things like that, then why can't he make a fish or a whale which swallows a person without killing them? Like, okay, he did something so the stomach acid didn't dissolve, and there was, who knows, there was some magical, I don't want to say magical, that's not the right term, supernatural or divine, because magic is actually not, I believe that's very different, so I shouldn't have said magic, but divine source of supernatural power, angelic power. Clearly this is beyond comprehension. Obviously it's beyond our understanding, so we don't look at this from a rational, materialist, empiricist sort of framework. We try to have a coherent worldview, but yeah, obviously there's things that are beyond our comprehension. And Ramsey Paul also, from time to time, he mentions that he does believe in evolution. At least, I guess he believes that men come from an ape-like ancestor, and the general idea that came out of Darwin. Maybe not everything, and I know there's different ideas in evolution, but he has said as much several times, which I've seen in his videos. And if he was previously talking about how you don't give in to the left, don't give in to their worldview, but equality, democracy, and freedom, well, what about Darwinism and materialism, which go together? What about that? Because I guess it's not really something the left talks about. They don't really talk about Darwin all the time, but it is in the establishment. It's in the universities, for one thing. We get the Neil deGrasse Tysons, the Bill Nyes, other people. It's a way of dismissing the Christian narrative, which Paul says he's for, I guess, but then so it doesn't jive, it doesn't work, it doesn't mix, it doesn't cohere. These worldviews are not compatible. Theistic evolution is a term that was created to somehow make it all work with evolution. It doesn't work. It doesn't make sense. These people do not have a logical worldview. It's not all about logic, but partially that's what it's about. So, and I admit that maybe there's a hierarchy in Darwinism, like they say, hierarchy of races and supremacy and all that stuff, which I don't believe in, but that was an important aspect of it, and it goes a bit deeper than just the left. That goes a bit deeper than that, and I do think that the Darwinist or what you might call the evolutionary worldview is fairly fundamental to our times, at least from the establishment on downwards. It's that or a type of pagan. It blends in almost with a type of paganism, the world, the physical world, matter, materialism, the passing on of your genes and bloodlines, this sort of thing. These sort of physical markers being the primary value, the primary source of importance that we're striving towards, whereas this would be rejected by Christianity. Now, so that's not my problem. That's RamzPaul's problem. That's a tension which is very obvious in his worldview to anyone who would look at it. Look, whatever you think about the science and the evidence, and aside from the whole philosophical debate, because you have to get into it at a philosophical level before you start looking at evidence and what you call evidence. But even apart from all that debate, let's say that even if you went into the debate and you're convinced of evolution, fine. But my point is that tradition? Is it tradition? It's not. So at least in that sense, you could call yourself no longer a conservative. If that's the form of conservatism that we're going for here, it's actually quite watered down already. It's not going to stand the test of time. Because it's not tradition. Believing that men came from apes. You can believe that, but at least admit that's not traditional, and therefore that's not conservative. Humans are all animals, so we're all just equalized as animals. So that I see tying in more with equality, and obviously that just completely demeans the human. So how can you talk of these timeless abstract things which are good when humans are essentially animals?